It's my great pleasure to introduce you Professor Lynne Lancaster, Professor of Classics at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, where she has taught since 1997. She is the author of 2 books on ancient Roman art, architecture, and archaeology. One, Concrete Vaulted Construction in Imperial Rome, Innovations and Context, published in 2005. And most recently, Innovative Vaulting in Architecture of the Roman Empire, the 1st to the 4th century CE, published in 2015, this year, both published by Cambridge University Press. Professor Lancaster is one of those rare archaeologists who has a background in architecture. She received her Bachelor of Architecture degree from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, better known to us football fans as Virginia Tech. She then went on to receive a master's degree in classical archaeology from Lincoln College of Oxford University in England. And finally, she received a Doctor of Philosophy degree in classical archaeology from Wolfson College at Oxford. She is also a fellow, she is a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, where she resided and studied in 2001 and 2002. Her specialized areas of research and teaching are on Roman archaeology, construction technology, and the topography of ancient Rome. She has published articles in a variety of journals, including the American Journal of Archaeology, the Journal of Roman Archaeology, and Römische Mitteilungen, on subjects ranging from the use of terracotta vaulting tubes in Roman construction to the construction of churches, markets in Rome. She is also the author of a chapter on ancient construction materials in the Blackwell Companion to Roman Architecture, published in 2013. She was the 2007 recipient of the James R. Wiseman Book Award from the Archaeological Institute of America for her book, Concrete Vaulted Construction in Imperial Rome. In 2003, she received an Outstanding Alumni Award from the College of Architecture at Virginia Tech. Would you please welcome today Professor Lynne Lancaster.
Okay, I think I've turned myself on now. And I thank John for that lovely introduction. We were trying to remember when we last had dinner in Rome together, and we figured that it was in 1996 in Trastevere. And but I was actually here. John invited me in 2003, so it's been since 2003 that I've been here. Maybe we should turn the lights down. Oh, you're working. He's working on that. Okay. So this is it. Concrete. So I'm here today to try to convince you that concrete can really act as a lens for looking at the way technology and society interact. Now, more often I'm talking to a group of archaeologists. I'm really delighted to have a room full of architects here. So first, let me describe what we're looking at. Roman concrete is somewhat different than modern concrete. It's more like mortared rubble in the sense that it's got aggregate that's about this big, and the aggregate is actually hand placed in a lot of mortar, as opposed to being poured in like we do it today. But when properly done, this type of concrete can be molded into forms that create spectacular interior spaces like the Pantheon, a building that we'll see later, and I think this was the image used for my publicity poster. So in an effort to provide some sort of framework for exploring the broader significance of the development of concrete, I developed or I adopted someone else's definition of a technological innovation, and it states that an innovation consists of 4 elements. So the first element is accumulated knowledge. So basically, they had to know how to do things like make lime mortar before they could put the different elements together to make concrete. Second one would be evident need. What did they need to do with the technology? Why did they need it in the first place? Third is economic ability. Even if one needs something and has to know how to do it, you got to be able to pay for it. And then finally, the last one, which is the most interesting one, and the one that I'll spend the most time on, is how does it shed light on the larger issues of cultural, social, and political acceptability? Because you can have the technology to do something. The most obvious example today is we have polio vaccines, but in some third world countries, they don't want to use the polio vaccines because they're scared of them. So even though we have the technology, there's not the social acceptability. So I'm going to go through these 4 things in that order. And so I'm going to start with accumulated knowledge. The most important, other than developing the line mortar, was the understanding of the arch. And I'm sure you guys always know that, but the basic idea of the arch is that you have these wedge-shaped voussoirs, and when you have a vertical load down, they transfer all the compressive pressure to either side, and basically the stones are particularly geared for an arch because all of the pressures stay in compression and there's no tension. So this is actually a still standing arch from Alexandria Troas near Troy in Turkey. So as long as there's sufficient resistance on either side of the arch to keep it from spreading out, it's going to stay stable. And so there's a little animation of how the forces are going through the stones. And excavations in the Roman Forum have actually shown that the Romans were using arches from as early as the 6th century BC. It used to be thought that they didn't use them until later, but we know now that they were using arches for much longer before the time that we're going to be talking about today, which is mainly imperial. So they had accumulated that knowledge. The second bit of accumulated knowledge that led to concrete vaulting was the realization that a volcanic ash called puzzolana, which you see here, could increase the strength of the mortar. Basically, if you add puzzolana, good puzzolana, to your lime mortar, it can increase the strength by 8 to 10 times. And the earliest use of puzzolana in mortar was probably the 2nd century BC. And there's different types of puzzolana depending on which volcano produced it. So this is the type that the white type that comes from Pozzuoli, which is where it got its name. These are actually the types that you see in Rome. I know a lot of you have probably been to Rome, and when you see in the mortar the little dark specks, that's what the puzzolana is. So evident need. As time went on, concrete vaults became larger and larger. And so what sort of evident need is there to make them want these complex system of vaults? The most interesting advances occur in buildings made to accommodate large gatherings of people. And when you think of large gatherings of Romans, what immediately comes to mind? Gladiators in the amphitheater and naked people in bathrooms. And it's really these 2 types of buildings where the most advances occurred. It's interesting to compare the 2 because if you think about it, for amphitheaters and theaters, basically what you need are a lot of little vaults connected in really complex ways so that people can get into the building, and then the people are all sitting on top of the vaults. Whereas in a bath building, you need to control the heat for the heated rooms. And so in the bath building, that's when you're looking for large span buildings because the people are under the vaults. So there's sort of like an over-under thing going on here. Now, during the late 1st century BC, at the time of Augustus, the population of Rome was growing and the public spaces had to become larger to accommodate all of these people who were basically flooding into Rome. So that leads us to economic ability. How did the Romans construct large building projects? So here's a question. How many people here can name their emperors in order? Ooh, not too many hands. Okay, that's why I'm going to give you a little history lesson before we get in here. We're going to do a timeline, and I'm going to hit some of the high spots that will explain to you how things were funded and hit some of the major monuments. So here's a basic timeline, and we're going to be focusing on the imperial period, which is basically AD. So the change from the republican system to the imperial system was really important for technological change. And part of the difference was during the Republic, when you had large building projects, they had magistrates that were elected for one-year terms who were in charge of the funding. And so that magistrate only had 1 year to get done what he needed to get done. So we'll start sort of in the late Republic. So in the mid-1st century, this system began to break down due to civil war. And as an attempt to establish peace, the Roman people elected Julius Caesar as dictator. And in the Roman world, that was actually an elected position that had a 6-month term. And the thing was, they elected him dictator again and again and again, and then they just said, "Oh, give it to him for life." That was the problem. And when they said they gave the dictatorship to Julius Caesar for life, that's when Brutus and Cassius came in and stabbed him as he was coming out of the Senate meeting. So off with Julius Caesar, and into the power vacuum steps his loyal supporter, Mark Antony, who was aided by his wealthy lover, Cleopatra, and Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian, who he had adopted as his son. And also, there was a third guy, but Lepidus, he didn't do anything, so I'm not talking about and basically, Antony and Octavian split the territory between them, and they hated each other. And so power sharing only lasted so long, and in the end, Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Octavian is given the title of Augustus, and he effectively becomes the first emperor of Rome. So for the first time in the history of Rome, one man, Octavian, who had inherited all the wealth from his granduncle Caesar, had more wealth than the state itself. And this allowed him to make choices that those little magistrates could make in the past. So he established one of the first great building programs, and he also encouraged people, his friends, to help him. Now we're going to skip over some emperors to Nero, who everyone has certainly heard of. Nero was one of the most creative of the fiscal managers. He developed the mise bandero approach of more with less. He took the basic Roman coin, which is in silver denarius. He reduced its weight by 10%, and he reduced the purity by 4.5%. He melted them down, and out of 8 coins, he made 9 new coins. So that's the way to create more money. Hey. So under Nero, there was this great fire that destroys over half of Rome in 64 AD. And so with his newly extended budget, he built himself this magnificent villa in the center of Rome, the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House of Nero, as well as a splendid public bath building. Just curious, how many of you have been to the Golden House of Nero? Oh, yeah, okay, some hands. He didn't get to enjoy his palace for very long because he was forced to commit suicide. So gone is Nero. We have the year 69, the year of the four emperors. Basically, the guy who came out on top was Vespasian. And his claim to fame was the construction of the Colosseum, which was funded from the famous spoils of war taken from the defeat of the Jews and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Shortly after Vespasian died in 79, we then have the explosion of Vesuvius, which destroyed Pompeii, and his son Titus was sort of left to clean up that mess. The next of the big Roman builders that I'll focus on is Trajan. By the early 2nd century, the empire was at its height under Trajan when he annexed both Dacia, which is modern Romania, and what Trajan's column celebrates, and Parthia in modern Iraq. And his forum and Basilica Oviya, which I'll talk about later, were funded from the spoils of the Dacian War. So we've got Colosseum funded from the Jews, we've got Trajan's forum funded from the Dacian Wars, which gave the Romans control over the gold and silver mines in Dacia, which was a big boom. Hadrian then comes in and he basically, inherits everything that Trajan had gained. And he completed one of the most impressive vaulted structures attempted, the Pantheon. After Hadrian, things sort of go downhill. There was a big plague and people started dying off, the armies got smaller, and really building went down a lot in Rome during the Antonines and under Marcus Aurelius. And there just aren't that many public buildings in Rome during this period. When the Severans came in, they sort of renewed public building, and Caracalla was another of the great builders who built the Baths of Caracalla. Now, he had an inspiration in terms of how to get more money for public building. You increase the tax base. So basically, he extended the Roman citizenship to everyone in the empire and said, okay, you're citizens now, pay your taxes. And so he raked in the tax contributions and used that for his building projects. He too was eventually murdered. And then we really enter into a period that's often called the 3rd century crisis. And over the next 50 years, there were 25 different emperors, and hardly any of them died a natural death. They were just sort of killing each other left and right. This created great disruption, so there was this great economic crisis. And Diocletian is the guy who came in and eventually brought stability back to Rome and to the empire. And to mark this accomplishment, he had a bath building constructed in his name, the Baths of Diocletian, or today Santa Maria degli Angeli in Rome. And this was a gift to the Roman people, and it was really a statement that we are back to where we were because we can do this now. And then finally, Constantine comes to power, legalizes Christianity in 313, and then in 330 moves the capital to his new city of Constantinople, modern Istanbul. And then the most creative vaulting really leaves Rome for a while. And one can think of the Hagia Sophia as sort of the iconic building of Constantinople. So this is a brief economic and historical overview, and I hope to have given you an idea of how the emperors were able to muster a lot more money than the Republican magistrates ever could, even if they had wanted to. So this gets to the most interesting part, the social, cultural, and political acceptability, or what can concrete vaulting tell us about Roman society? So to do this, I want to introduce you to some basic construction techniques and structural concepts. And, okay, so two things, the relieving arch and the vaulting rib. So the two elements that the Romans used to make their concrete vaulted structures larger and more complex were these two elements. So the relieving arch over here is simply an arch built into a solid wall as a means of channeling the weight of the wall to specific places. And when you're wandering around in Rome and you see one of these arches that doesn't have an opening under it, you can usually guess there's something interesting going on under the ends of those arches. Sometimes it'll be a drain, but sometimes, as in this case, it will be much more interesting. Over here is a vaulting rib. So this is a concrete vault. And basically the vaulting rib is just a reinforced part of the vault made of a proper arch made of either stones or bricks. And that too was devised to channel the loads of the building to particular points. So if we go to the Colosseum, these two elements, each of which had been used individually before the Colosseum, were for the first time sort of united into this complex system at the Colosseum. So one of the issues at the Colosseum that the builders ran into is that when you're building something as complex as the Colosseum, where you have all the different stairways, but then you have these underground areas where the gladiators are and where the animals are brought in, you end up with situations where one wall is not sitting on top of the wall below it. And so you can see for example, in this underground space, there's actually sort of a wall here, and it doesn't have anything under it there. So this is a detail of what is going on structurally in this area. And so at the underground level, basically you have a vault here and here. And so what they did was very clever. They basically put a relieving arch here in the wall. So that arch that we just saw there is actually this one. And then underneath here, they reinforced the vault so that the weight is going onto this arch, and then it's going onto that arch, and then that arch is transferring it down. So you can see they're not thinking in plans so much. They're really thinking in a three-dimensional way. There's my load points going through there. Okay, so that was sort of the beginning of this three-dimensional way of thinking. And so now I want to skip ahead about 30 years to the Forum of Trajan. So just to keep you oriented, here's the Forum Romanum here, the Senate House of the Curia is there. This is the Forum of Caesar here, Temple of Venus, Forum of Augustus here, Forum of Trajan there, Trajan's column. Now, in the background with the Forum of Trajan here, when Trajan added his forum, he actually had to do some modifications to the Forum of Caesar because the two buildings connect. And before talking about the Basilica Oviya over here, I want to go to a much more mundane structure, the latrine. This is the coolest latrine ever. So when Trajan made all these modifications, he also did some restructuring over here, and he added this very elegant latrine, which is located right next to the Senate House. And I'm tempted to think, given how elegant it is, it was the senatorial latrine, but I can't prove that. However, it did, I'm going to show you, it's semicircular. Okay, so here's the seats. So the seats are all going, there's the seats there. So you'd sit there, you had a colonnade, and then there were actually big windows here. So you'd sit there, you're looking out, you're you're looking out on the Temple of Venus. It was really, very nice. But the thing about it is, it was built on the second floor. Now think about that. So these are actually the original vaulted rooms from Caesar's time, and they have parallel walls. Trajan came and he put this semi-elliptical latrine above, and things didn't line up. So just probably know how latrine works, but so the way a Roman latrine works is it's hooked up to a public latrine. It's hooked up to the aqueduct, and so basically you have continuously running water from the aqueduct here, and then that's dirty water, and then you have clean, usually a channel with clean water where you can rinse your sponge out. And so the equivalent of this right here is this right here. Now there is a potential messy hazard going on there when you're putting this latrine on top, and you can actually see they raised it up a little bit, sort of like the hypocaust of a bath, and that was just to give it some separation. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to like peel away the skin of this latrine and just show you its structure. So that's the series of relieving arches and vaulting ribs. And to compensate for the lack of correspondence between the walls, they made this amazing grid or web of these relieving arches in the walls here and the vaulting ribs there. So I'm going to show you how this works. Let's just remember the columns are right here. So let's say a column comes down there. Okay, well, that's set on top of this arch. So that channels those down to the walls. Okay, that's good. Now, if we go back to the wall over here, okay, we have the load coming down onto the arches. We have the arches over here going to the wall, but here it's going onto the top of the vaulting rib. And so then that vaulting rib takes it down to the walls. You all draw and know how difficult it is to conceptualize things like this. You can just imagine the skill that it took to sort of figure out all of this. I really think this is probably one of the most sophisticated structures built before the Pantheon. And it was only built about 10 or 15 years before the Pantheon was completed. So it's very possible that you could have, the same teams of workers involved in both projects. We can't prove that, but chronologically it would work. And this system is really applied in a sort of different version at the Pantheon. So you probably recognize this drawing of the Pantheon. So the dome is undoubtedly one of the most sophisticated and impressive domes ever built. It's 43 meters across, which is about half of a football field. And it's twice as long as any dome that we know of that had been built earlier. The next closest one is 20 meters at Baia. And so they've sort of over doubled the scale of the Pantheon. And as you can see from this cutaway, the dome actually has relieving arches built into it, and the wall has these hollow spaces, which I'll talk about a bit more. Now, when you are walking down the street in Rome, you see the drum. If you look closely, and I'm going to highlight these, you'll actually see the ends of these relieving arches. The relieving arches are actually the ends of extruded ribs that go, the drum wall is 20 feet thick. And so these are basically like vaulting ribs, but they extend 20 feet into the wall and basically become vaults themselves. So again, I'm going to do a thing where I sort of strip it away and show you the guts of the Pantheon. So that would be sort of what we would see if we could peel it away. And in fact, the drum is really a series of 8 piers. So the green bit is all hollow bit. But the place where the load is coming down is actually these places in red, which line up with the ends of those relieving arches. So all of those relieving arches are very carefully placed to channel the weight of the dome evenly around the foundations. And the Pantheon is built in a floodplain. They've not ever found like the bottom of the concrete foundation, so we don't really know how far down it goes. But from other buildings like the Theater of Marcellus, we know that they actually put in oak piling under the foundations before they put the concrete down. And my guess is that if we could find out that the Pantheon would probably be sitting on a lot of oak pilings. But obviously, when you're in a floodplain, the even distribution of so much weight is really important. So in these brick ribs, these are sort of like the brick ribs of the latrine, but they've been sort of extruded the 20-foot thickness of the walls, and they're also acting as buttresses because obviously the dome is pushing out, something we'll get back to. And so they don't look like an external buttress the way we think of, at Chartres Cathedral or something, but they are in fact giving the thickness to act as buttresses. So after this introduction to the development of vaulting ribs, how does this tell us anything about Roman society? So in Rome, the vaulting ribs first appear at the Colosseum in 80 AD. The Pantheon was finished in 128 AD. And they were at the Colosseum, they were made in both travertine and brick. But after the Colosseum pretty much became the material of choice. And so this leads us to the brick industry in Rome. Oh, I forgot about this one. Okay, I just had a really good time with this. I was just thinking about the Pantheon and about those forces and like how the forces are going through. And so don't blink or you'll miss something. But it gives you a good sense of sort of the way the builders were thinking of things. Brick stamps that don't go away. This is going to be interesting. Brick stamps can be cool too. So brick stamps were stamped with the name of the landowner and the maker of the brick, or some of them were. The 2nd century they were. And the brick industry really began to develop after that fire of 64 under Nero, because all of a sudden everybody was all about fireproofing, which is understandable. And so from these stamps, we learned that under Trajan, who is sort of first 2 decades of the 2nd century, the number of landowners supplying the clay for the bricks suddenly rose dramatically. And this phenomenon is actually explained by a letter from Pliny the Younger, who was writing Trajan, and he mentions that there's a new law stating that candidates for public office in Rome had to invest 1/3 of their capital in land holdings in Italy. So if you want to be in the Senate, then you need to have local property. And one way to exploit new property was to use the clay. And brick production is one of the best examples to show the way in which technological innovation was tied to the local economy, which in turn was related to political and legal decisions. So I'm going to give you a drawing of this stamp so we can read the letters a little bit better. This brick stamp, this is my favorite brick stamp ever. This is from Trajan's Markets, and it actually has 3 people in it. So this, okay, you see Aprilis and then a little soldier there. So Aprilis is actually a slave. And Aprilis, it's telling us, because this is in the genitive, which means that Aprilis belongs to Agathopoulos, who himself is also a slave of this guy Domitius Tullus here. So yes, a slave can have his own slave. And so if Agathobulus is free, then he can take Capriles with him. Domitius Tullus, we actually know because Pliny, he's a friend of Pliny the Younger, he talks about him. And they recently, like in the past 10 years, I think, they actually found a boundary marker up the Tiber River, and it says Domitiorum, because Domitius Tullus had a brother, so there's two of them, so this is plural. And so this is basically saying this is the land of the Domiti brothers. And there's all sorts of kilns and workshops that have been found there. So we actually know the guy who owned these two slaves. From a different stamp, we know that Agathobulus earned his freedom in 115 AD, and he did take Aprilis with him. He then freed Aprilis in 123, so that's like 8 years later, and Aprilis continued to make bricks on his own. This industry thus provides a means of social advancement, and it didn't just help out the lower classes. We know that women were involved in the brick industry. In fact, a lot of the landowners were senatorial women, and at least 6% of the brick makers were also women. So in terms of technological innovation and social acceptance, there was a certain incentive to use these new techniques using bricks because the production was really a boom for all levels of society. So from bricks, let's go back to walks. The Pantheon. So one of the things that's really great about concrete, and this is true today, is that by varying the type of aggregate, or cimenta, as the Romans called it, in the concrete, you can make heavy concrete or you can make light concrete. And that's one of the things that they did at the Pantheon, where in the lower part, they had cimenta of travertine, which is sort of like a heavy limestone. As they got higher, they started putting some tuff, which is a volcanic stone that's a little bit lighter. As they got up, they then removed the travertine, added brick. They went up to brick, and then they changed to a different type of tuff that's lighter than this one. But then at the very top, they put yellow tuff and volcanic scoria. So this part that I've colored yellow. And the volcanic scoria is interesting when you look at it. So this is the yellow tuff. Like all those little speckles, that's the pozzolana in there. And then this is the scoria. And I have some at home, and when I talk about the Pantheon to my classes, sometimes I'll bring in like a bowl of water and I'll put the scoria in it. And the scoria will actually float on the water until it absorbs the water. Then eventually it will sink. But it is very, very light. And you can sort of think of it as like you have a lava flow and there's all this steam that's coming out of the lava, and it sort of froths the lava, sort of like a cappuccino. Think of it as sort of frozen cappuccino skuma. And so this was an important part of how the Pantheon remained stable. And so I'm going to show you a thrust line. So if we imagine like the weight of the dome, the weight of the dome is sort of pushing down, and of course, because it's a dome, just like an arch, it's going to push out. The idea of the thrust line is that as long as this line, and this line can be calculated, and I actually did calculate it, but not on PowerPoint. As long as the line stays within the thickness of the wall, that means it's stable because everything is in compression. If the line goes outside the wall, that means you've got some tension. And when we get into masonry construction, tension is not what you want. But notice how they only made the very top part the lightest part. They didn't make the whole dome the light part. And that's also what accounts for the thickening here. Basically what they've done is they put a surcharge. They've made the dome thicker, and then they put heavier stuff in it there. And the Romans didn't know anything about thrust lines or vectors or anything. But they did understand that an arch pushes out. And if we don't want it to push out, either we push back this way or we push down on it, which makes it so that it doesn't push out so much. And so they were clearly thinking in these terms. Ironically, if they had made the whole dome wider, it actually would have been less stable. So that sort of gives you an idea of how sophisticated the thinking was behind this dome. Okay, once again, let's get back to the socioeconomic issues. Okay, the scoria that was so important at the Pantheon was actually imported from Mount Vesuvius on the Bay of Naples. And it's one of the very few non-decorative stones imported into the city. And in 2010, I teamed up with a group of Italian geologists, Guido, Gianluca, and Fabrizio. And actually, Guido and Gianluca and I went to Vesuvius, and Guido made a booking for us to stay in the observatory on the side of Vesuvius for like 3 nights, which was really cool. We had to bring our own water, but it was still very cool. So we couldn't get a sample of the scoria at the Pantheon, but this scoria was also used in other buildings in Rome. And so the example that I showed you there was actually from the Baths of Trajan. And so we had numerous other samples from the Baths of Caracalla, the Forum of Trajan, the Baths of Trajan, and the Forum of Caesar. And so we did geochemical analysis on those. And we also took some samples. The reason we're down on the mountain is we went to get some samples from the mountain itself. And so we were basically able to show that the scoria was indeed coming from the Bay of Naples, from the geochemical signatures. There was one quarry that we went to over here. This is Pompeii. It's really difficult to actually match the stone to a particular quarry. But one of the interesting things is, if you look at the pattern of the 79 AD explosion, we know from Pliny the Elder that the wind was blowing this way. And indeed, this is why Naples did not really get hit. And so this is Pompeii right here. And so the green is actually lava flows down the side of the mountain. But one of the things this shows is that this was in 79 AD. They really started to use this in the early 2nd century. So what, 25 years later. If they got it from over here, they wouldn't have been covered too much. They could have still gotten to the quarry. If they were getting it from over in here, they would have had to have dug all the way down through all the material from the explosion. And so it sort of gives you an idea of they're shipping it over here. So if they're getting it from back here, they've got to get it all the way around to this side of the mountain. If they're doing it over at Pompeii, which is really close to the sea, they've got to dig all the way down to get to it. So the emperors were putting a lot of effort into getting this stuff up to Rome. So the accumulated knowledge for using the Vesuvian scoria was there before the explosion, because there are examples in Rome before the explosion. Sometimes they were using it for decorative things as well. But the evident need to really exploit the material for large-scale vaults only came after the eruption. And economic ability was then enhanced under Trajan because he got all the gold and silver from those mines. But as I said, there were examples of this scoria used before the Pantheon, particularly in Trajanic buildings at the Trajan's Baths and Trajan's Forum. So we go to Trajan's Baths. The builders seem to have been experimenting a bit, and this picture comes from right here at Trajan's Baths. Because it's not used all over. But one of the things that they were also doing in conjunction with making the vaults lighter is that they were experimenting with another method of controlling lateral thrust through iron tie bars. And we tend to think of tie bars as being sort of a Renaissance portico kind of thing. But actually, the Romans were doing it. They were just hiding them. So this is the area we're going to look at is right here. And so there's a portico. This is sort of an exercise yard. There's a portico around here. The tie bars went right here. And so we're going to look at this. So there's the plan again. So this is sort of my reconstruction of how the portico worked. And the first thing that you guys are going to notice is that the tie bar is at the top and not at the bottom where you want it to be. Romans didn't want to see it, I guess, because they went to some effort to conceal it in the crown of the vault. But what they did was they doweled and clamped the stones of the facade wall here and also to the top of the column together so that it was sort of rigid. And then they put the tie bar in here. And we don't have the tie bar, but we actually have the block that was inserted into the concrete. And you can't see it so well here, but there's actually a little hole that goes in there for the tie bar to hook into, so that we know that they were being used. And so I mean, this is really a pretty sophisticated use of concrete vaults, because this is a pretty spindly structure. If we go over to the Forum of Trajan, which was contemporary, I actually took this from the top of Trajan's column, and you're looking down on the Basilica Oviya, or the reconstructed bits of the Basilica Oviya, which has lots and lots of columns. If we look at a reconstruction, so this is the plan of the Basilica Oviya, and okay, there's not everyone agrees on the precise plan of the Basilica Oviya, but this is a section through one version of the plan. No matter how it's reconstructed, it's a very precarious vaulted structure, as you can see. One of the things that is unusual is that these aisles are vaulted. Up until this point, basilicas just had a wooden roof structure. But we know that the aisles were vaulted because they found big chunks fallen on the ground, which you see here. And you can see the dark scoria alternating with the yellow, just like what we saw at the Pantheon. And so one reason the scoria was so critical, presumably in this case, was because the vaults were supported on this sea of columns that were connected by marble architraves, and we do have parts of the architraves. And so it was a very fragile structure, again, even more so than the Baths of Trajan. And here also we do have examples that prove that tie bars were used. And so you can see there's tie bars here, and this one is actually placed to right there. And actually the fallen vault that I showed you was right there in the reconstruction. So why did they want to put the columns and the vaults together? It would have been so much easier just to put a wooden roof on this like they always did before. One reason, I think, is for the public display of colored stones taken from captured territories. The Basilica Oviya employed over 100 of the speckled gray stones. And oops, that's not the right one. That's the right one. as you see here. And then, I mean, the other reason is, the previous slide, is that the above the aisles, they probably wanted a flat terrace rather than, you know, a pitched roof, so that people could go up and actually see some of the designs from the column of Trajan. So this basilica had an added purpose than previous ones did. The Romans were really into these colored columns. In the case of the gray granite, okay, so these are the most typical of the colored columns that they use. In the Basilica Oviya, they use giallo antico from Tunisia, Cipollino from Euboea in Greece, and then this Paganazzetto from Turkey, and then Mons Claudianus. This was special. This was one of the most expensive stones. Partly because it was quarried in the eastern desert of Egypt, and it had to be carted over 100 kilometers across the desert before reaching the Nile, where it could then be put on a boat, and it was fairly easy to get to Rome. But those 100 kilometers of desert were a major factor, and so you tend to find this mainly in imperial monuments and not in other monuments. So basically, the use of so many columns was a statement of power and wealth. So this desire to display the columns is surely one of the things that led them to want to use columns instead of, say, piers, which would be a lot more stable. You know, if you put piers with arches, that would be easier. But they wanted columns, and so the tie bars were developed as a way to have both the vaults and the columns together. And just to show you that I'm not just making this up about like how they thought about colored stones. Seneca, who some of you may know, was forced. He was the tutor of Nero, and Nero eventually forced Seneca to commit suicide. So in the mid-1st century, Seneca is saying this. So this is mid-1st century, is like 50 years before Trajan. Children are delighted by the smooth and variegated pebbles they pick up on the beach, while we take delight in tall columns of spotted marble, brought either from the Egyptian sands or from African deserts for a colonnaded portico, or a dining hall large enough to contain a city crowd. We admire the walls veneered with a thin layer of marble, although we know what defects it conceals. They actually knew that these things weren't solid marble too. So with all this marble coming in and being used for both columns and wall facings, another factor that can't be underestimated in looking at cultural factors is the development of window glass. Okay. So window glass only came into use in the early 1st century AD, and it brought with it an entirely new perception of light and space. So this revelation, which it must have been something like the light bulb for us, the revelation soon became an expectation, and people expected to have light in their buildings so that they could see all this wonderful colored marble. So these are two pieces of marble found at Pompeii. So Seneca is going on again, and he says, nowadays, let me just explain. He's going to mention Scipio. So Scipio is this old general who had lived like 200 years before. So he's looking back in the past. Nowadays, people speak of a bath as fit only for moths, unless it has been designed to catch the sun through enormous windows all day long. Some people these days condemn Scipio as a bore because he did not let daylight into the hot room of his bath through wide panes of glass, because he did not stew in strong sunlight, daydreaming until he was perfectly cooked. If we go to Pompeii, this is the form bath at Pompeii, 2nd century BC. This is probably along the lines of what Scipio would have had, but his were private, so maybe a little bit smaller. But you can see not a whole lot of light in here. But, you know, given the choice, this is really much nicer. And this is the baths of Diocletian, which were turned by Michelangelo into Santa Maria degli Angeli. But these baths were modeled on the baths of Trajan that we just saw with the tie bars. And these baths, too, I would just mention that used tie bars in the exact same way that they did at Trajan's baths. If we go up on to the roof of the baths of Diocletian, so we're going to be just like outside that window. We actually see these massive buttresses. So this window right here is the same as this. Now, the window glass is not the ancient window glass, but originally it did have window glass in there, and then window glass has been excavated at baths. So the central space here is about 25 meters wide, which is about the largest vaulted spans, other than those covered by domes from the Roman world. And that was allowed because of the use of these buttresses, because they could put cross vaults in as opposed to barrel vaults, and cross vaults, of course, are what allow the light for the windows for the light to come in. Now, finally, these buttresses. How many people know what a buttress is? Yeah, you know, when I first started, I was trained as an architect. When I first started teaching undergraduates, I was going on about buttresses, and finally one kid raised his hand and said, "Ma'am, what's a buttress?" And it had never dawned on me, being, you know, an architecture student, that people wouldn't know. I assumed that you guys did, in fact, know what they were. But so, just wait, when you get out in the world, you have to explain this stuff. So, you know, to see all of these marbles that Seneca derived so much, you had to have lots of glass, and so structural elements like the buttress were critical in sort of changing people's perception of space. Now, finally, these baths also employed lightweight stones to lighten their vaults, but interestingly, these stones were not the Vesuvian scoria that had been used earlier, but it's sort of a type of yellow grayish stuff. And it had been assumed that the pumice, and pumice is similar to scoria. The difference, scoria is like the congealed frost, whereas pumice is airborne, basically. So it had been assumed that this pumice came from the volcanic districts north of Rome, because it has this mineral called sanidine in it, which was a signature for these this type of stone. And this is what I reported in my book in 2005. But when we did the geochemical analysis in 2010, I just threw a sample of this stuff in, and lo and behold, it too came from the Bay of Naples, but not from Vesuvius. It actually came from over here. Vesuvius is its own volcano, and then there's another volcano, which is called the Campi Flegrei over here. And that actually came from over in this direction. So the question remains, why this sudden change away from the Vesuvian scoria that had been used for over 2 centuries? And one possibility is that the economic crisis in the 3rd century that I showed you, you know, maybe, and this Diocletian came after that. You know, maybe it made the land transport no longer economically feasible. So they turned to the material that was closer to the sea and closer to the port. And, you know, as we see in economic downturns, even today, one of the things that happened is everything's scaled back. So like stores no longer keep as many items in stock. We have fewer flights, they're always full. Sometimes there's fewer bus runs. Maybe that's what we're seeing with this change from the volcanic scoria of Vesuvius. And I have to say that the stuff from Vesuvius is better. It looks like really fragile, but it's really, really tough. So it's light tough. This stuff is sort of crumbling, and so really not as good. So that's the end of my story, but I hope that I've given you an idea of how what seems like a really mundane subject can open up questions of all sorts, and give some insight into the culture. Though as a postscript, I'll say most of the material that I presented today came from my 2005 book. I added some more recent work in with the geochemical analysis. But after I finished this book in 2005, I sort of took the natural next step and began asking, well, if all this was going on in Rome, what was happening everywhere else? And so for the past decade, I've actually been working on my new book, which just came out a couple of months ago. It's titled Innovative Vaulting in the Architecture of the Roman Empire. I was going to call it in the architecture of the Roman provinces. Oh, no, province, that's a bad word. That's a low word. We want empire. But in fact, it is a study of things not in Italy for the most part. So for those of you who might be interested, this is the first illustration in the book. It just basically shows what I do in the new book. I do take a look at Opus Chimontichium and ask, well, who had pozzolana? Were the people in Italy the only ones that had pozzolana? The answer is really no. Other people had pozzolana. And then I started looking at a lot of brick vaults, which is another way that they dealt with places that didn't have pozzolana, which actually ended up in some really innovative forms. In cases, vaulting tubes, which are these really cool little things. They're like little Coke bottles without a body, and you sort of stick them together and make a vault, and you don't need any centering. Hollow voussoirs, which are for bath buildings for heated vaults. And then finally, these things I call armchair voussoirs, which are sort of like an erector kit for little villa baths or something. So that's, anyway, where I've gone since doing all the concrete stuff. So I'll be glad to take questions if you have questions.
Can I ask you about chicken and the egg question?
Oh.
So innovation in design, innovation in technology. Which one comes first? Do you have a design you want to realize and you find technology to realize it, or do you discover a technology and then think of ways to use it?
I think it's according to the circumstance. I think it happens both ways. I've just been writing a chapter on technology, which so I've done a lot of work into sort of the history of how one looks at technology, and there's been during the 20th century there was there's sort of this myth that the Romans had this stagnant technology because they didn't use the water mill and they hadn't invented the horse collar, and they only did that in the medieval period. So medieval people are much more technologically advanced than the Romans, which is not true actually. But it also implicit in that whole thing is that we are on a technological upward path, and so that everything has to be better than the next thing, when in fact there's something called a technology shelf, and so the Romans could choose different things. They didn't invent the horse collar because they didn't need the horse collar. They had oxen for plowing their fields, and they used horses for racing chariots. The horse was like the sports car of the ancient world. And so they wouldn't dream of putting horse collar on the plow. But I think when looking at it, you have to look at the fact that there are different choices, and the societal factors will affect which choice is made. And just because a society like doesn't adopt something doesn't mean that like they weren't smart enough to do it. It just means it didn't fulfill their particular needs. And that didn't exactly answer what you were saying, but with the chicken and the egg thing, I can't. But it brought up interesting issues.
As an architect, though, not as a scholar or as a classicist, but as an architect.
Well, I worked as an architect for a couple of years before going off to graduate school. And well, when I was working in the office, I was like at the bottom of the totem pole, so I wasn't doing anything very creative. But since then, I've done lots of stuff with my own house, and usually when I'm working on my own house, there's a problem, and then I'm reacting to solve the problem. But that's different from designing something from scratch. And I like the idea of doing modifications on existing buildings because you are sort of put into a box with parameters, and it limits things. I find a blank slate like really scary, and I really admire the people who can work with a blank slate.
Has there been any research done on iron production, where the iron ore came from, where the iron production factories were?
Well, there's not that much around Rome. There was some iron in like the Republican period that came from Populonia, and they in the Etruscan period, I think they used up a lot of that. The place that we know from ancient authors that like made the best swords is from Noricum, I think is in part of Austria, sort of in that area. And it had a particularly good type of iron that allowed it to make good swords, but you don't need that quality of iron to make a pipe iron. Iron is like the most plentiful ore on the planet. So coming up with iron ore was not the big thing. It was more the effort that went into producing it, because you have to have a higher temperature than the other ores that have a really high melting temperature. But I have a friend, Carla Michi, who is now, that's what she's working on. She's working on metal in architecture. So hopefully we will have a book out on metal in architecture in the next 2 years.
No question. Who designed Pantheon?
Oh, not Hadrian.
Not Hadrian. The construction started right away, or in 100 AD, right?
Well, okay, that opens up
In regards to is there any, considering the super complex structural system of the Great Hall of Trajan's market, do you see a connection between that complexity and the complexity that you described?
Yes, I do. It's interesting. In one of the early articles that I published on Trajan's markets, I talked about this technique where they put bricks flat up against the vault, presumably to make sort of a liner so that they could take the centering down. But some of those bricks at Trajan's markets have this hole chipped into it. And it doesn't occur at any other place except for in the latrine in the Forum of Caesar, which was being built at the same time, which I proposed, the same workers were working on the latrine as were working on the Trajan's markets. I guess the question is, did Apollodorus do it? Because Apollodorus, we know, was the architect of Trajan's Forum. What I've said in print is that I think whoever designed the Pantheon was in the school of Apollodorus. And it's really hard to, without literary evidence, to associate a particular personality with the Pantheon. But certainly the same mentality, I think, you're seeing in that period. And some of you may know, I didn't really get into it because it's sort of complicated, but there's a new argument that, like, if you read Ward Perkins or any handbook, it'll say the Pantheon was finished by Hadrian, and we have brick stamps of 123 AD that tell us that Hadrian did this. Well, it turns out somebody went and looked at all the brick stamps, and in fact, there's like only one brick stamp that's dated, and it's actually not in the fabric of the building. It's actually sort of like behind the revetment. And all the other brick stamps don't have dates. They have, from the people we know, they were made sometime between late Trajan and early Hadrian, which has opened up the possibility that the Pantheon was started under Trajan and only completed under Hadrian. And so that's sort of the latest hoopla around the Pantheon. But yeah, I mean, I definitely see a connection between the type of thinking going on between the latrine and the aula, for example, and the Pantheon, but not Hadrian.
We have a slide that has the section through the Pantheon with the different layers of construction. Can you go to that, please?
Yeah.
Right. So section 5 especially, which is brick and tooth, is very small relative to the other ones. Can you talk about what system we can find or what they might have used to determine where to change a layer into a different layer and maybe why that one in particular is so small?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I could have some guesses that it might have something to do with how the centering was built and stages at which, and there may even be courses of bipedales that separate them. This is basically from the Finlet's book on the Pantheon. But under Mussolini, they basically had scaffolding up and they had taken the plaster off so that you could actually see what was under there. So they have actually seen, you know, what the stuff is. And in fact, for this part up here, if you go back in the back, they've actually cut out a chunk. And so I do have an old bad slide of a chunk showing the scoria and the yellow stuff from the Pantheon. So they did take a little bit out of there. But yeah, I don't know why that's such a slim bit. It's an interesting question. I guess I've been focusing more on the fact that they limited it to the cap, which I thought was so interesting, and just revealed sort of the way they were thinking about it.
With respect to the iron tracing and like you want to call it rebar,
Right.
what was the impact on the longevity of the structure?
Well, we don't really know exactly when some of these things came down. I'm sure most of these came down in earthquakes, but you know, I don't think we have the evidence to know, like, did those come down before another part of the building did or not? So, yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, with the tie bars too, I think part of it was also during the construction process, because you can imagine you're putting the vaults up and you've got all these columns that are just sort of freestanding there. And so the bars would have also provided sort of a brace during construction.
I mean, given the remarkable complexity of such section system, leading arches and so on, design-wise, do you make design drawings?
Yes.
Second drawings? We know that they were ornament, right?
Yeah. And there are lots of plans and sections drawn into paving blocks. Sometimes full scale, sometimes at maybe half scale or something. Yeah, Marcos. Oh, yeah, Lothar Hasselberger's. Yeah. And that, I mean, even since Lothar Hasselberger found the stuff at Didyma, which is Hellenistic, there's been loads more of these found. So I mean, it's pretty clear that on the building site, like they were drawing stuff out on the building site. And we know also from papyri that are found in Egypt, that they were making building plans, and even the Egyptians, like in the New Kingdom, were making fairly sophisticated drawings of the tombs and stuff. So I think they had the drawing in hand pretty much.
I think it was Raven Taylor
Mhm.
who was supposing that some common buildings were, the technical design and design itself was done by model, scaled models. But
Yeah, you know, we don't have any evidence. I mean, we know there are mentions of models, but we don't always know like what type of model that means. So, you know, in terms of like Brunelleschi or something like that, it's certainly possible, but there, you know, we just don't have the evidence for it. I tend to be of the school that I like to ask questions that I think have evidence to answer, rather than doing a lot of speculation, I guess.
I'm just wondering, the use of amphora in enclosed vases, so I'm just one sometimes see, for instance, in the surface of
Mhm.
extensions.
Yeah.
You know, broken parts. Is that something that is introduced later as a new sort of invention, or does that go way back to the original concrete?
No, that actually in the concrete book, I have a whole chapter on that, and it's really interesting. The earliest ones we have in vaults are from the Hadrianic period. The interesting thing about it, though, is that they're down here, which is not where you want to lighten the vault, you know? And I've also found some where they're in the walls. And so when I wrote that book, I made what I think some people thought was a contentious suggestion that this was a way of getting rid of indestructible material and saving on materials, by making hollow spaces in the vault. Because if you want it lighter, you want it lighter at the top, not at the bottom. But one thing that you do find is that like it gets to be very popular under Maxentius and at a time when there are not as many resources. And so it might have made sense that they wanted to use everything in the most efficient way possible. Because those ones at Maxentius, I mean, that must have saved, I think I may have even done a calculation. I mean, it must have saved them tons and tons of material. Oh, and sometimes you will read and you will hear people on like Discovery saying that there are these pots in the Pantheon. It is not true. No pots in the Pantheon. It drives me crazy when people say that.
The pot in the Pantheon. Always like